All right, everybody, it's been a long, long time, but here it is, The Little Riders, Chapter 5. Can't wait to see what happens. Here we go. The winter started early that year. In November, the weather was already bitter cold with sleet and snow and an icy wind that blew from the northeast over the flatlands below the sea. The fuel rations were far too small to heat the whole house. Grandfather and grandmother closed off the downstairs of the house and moved upstairs to the den. With the pot-bellied stove blazing red, the den sometimes looked almost cozy, Johanna thought. But even the little stove used up too much of the fuel that had to last all through the winter. Sometimes Dirk came and brought them a little load of wood, but often Grandfather and Johanna went out with the axe and saw to chop down a small tree in the park at the edge of town. Each time Johanna remembered how she had walked there with Grandfather on summer evenings in the early years of the war. The park had always been shady and cool with the big old linden trees, and the whole town had smelled of their blossoms. Along the stream that flowed through the park stood the willow trees from which Grandfather used to cut whistles for Johanna. Now the old trees had all been chopped down by the Germans for fuel, leaving the park bare and mutilated, with only dark stumps sticking out from the stiff and frozen earth. The soldiers had left so few trees that Grandfather and Johanna had to go far down the stream to find even a small young willow tree. Grandfather was handy with an axe and saw, and after Johanna had piled the wood neatly on her sled, together they pulled their precious load home, pausing from time to time to blow life back into their frozen hands. Almost worse than the cold and the shortage of fuel was the hunger. Johanna had never felt really hungry before, but now she often woke in the middle of the night with a tight, empty feeling in her stomach, almost like a pain. Sometimes Grandmother would put an apple, if she had one, on the table next to Johanna's bed, and Johanna would eat it very slowly. After that, it was easier to fall asleep. But as the winter went on, it became harder and harder to get apples or any other food. On days when it wasn't too cold, Grandfather and Johanna went foraging in the country on their bicycles. Their bicycles now had wooden tires, and they were so heavy to push against the strong, cold wind that Grandfather and Johanna never got far. Usually they ended up at Dirk's farm. Dirk never sent anybody away with empty hands, and so they came home with milk and a small bag of wheat, and sometimes even a few eggs. Captain Braun wasn't home much during these winter months. His attic room was so cold that he spent most of the days at the barracks, returning late at night when everybody was already asleep, and leaving again early in the morning when nobody was up yet. On a day when Captain Braun was away from his room as usual, Johanna slipped up to the attic to get the radio for Grandfather. The bolt on the door of the cubbyhole moved easily now, and she knew exactly where she had put the radio. She didn't dare take out the little riders and look at them, but they seemed safe and snug in their warm sacks. Through a sack she could feel the sturdy legs of one of the galloping horses. She smiled and closed the door. The attic was very cold, and the room had a lost and lonesome look. Captain Braun's flute was, as always, lying on the table. He seldom played now. Johanna wondered if it was because of the airplanes going over, or because his hands were too stiff from the cold. Sometimes at night she lay awake hoping to hear music again, and sometimes if she got up and made a great deal of noise about opening her door, after a time the thin, pure voice of the flute would come floating down from the attic. Grandfather and Grandmother never spoke to Captain Braun about the night he helped Johanna hide the riders. At first, they had waited for Captain Braun to mention it to them, but he had never said a word except for a polite "good morning" or "good evening." "It is probably better for us not to interfere," Grandfather said. That was something between Captain Braun and Johanna, and we had better leave it that way. It must not have been easy for him to hide the riders from his own people. But grandfather never looked at Captain Braun in the cold, forbidding way he had before, and grandmother sometimes even spoke a few words with him about the weather. Not only did the winter start early that year, it lasted endlessly long. In April, grandfather and Johanna still had to go out and get wood, hoping every time that this would be the last load they would need. The food rations were down to almost nothing, and the only things that kept the people alive were the hopeful news bulletins. The war couldn't last much longer. Soon Germany would surrender. The day Germany surrendered was a beautiful, warm day in May, just as it had been 5 years ago when the German troops entered Holland. Grandfather came home and stretched his arms out toward grandmother. "It is all over. We are free again." He kissed grandmother, and for one moment, Johanna didn't realize why they looked so different. Then she saw what she had never seen before. Their eyes were full of tears. She left them together and went upstairs to the den. From behind the books, she took the radio and put it on the table. She turned it on loud. There was nothing to be afraid of anymore. She turned on the Dutch station and then a few others, and every one told the same news. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. "They will never march any more and sing their horrible songs while they go through our town," she thought. "And I will never have to be afraid anymore that their footsteps will stop at our door. After that happened once, I have always waited for it to happen again, but now it never will." She went downstairs and found grandfather and grandmother in the living room. Grandmother was looking proudly at grandfather, who had just changed his clothes and was wearing for the first time openly the uniform of the Dutch Underground Army, a simple navy blue coverall with a holster and gun. All through the winter he had looked old and thin, but now he looked young again and strong and triumphant. "Come," grandfather said, "we'll take our first walk in our free town." The streets were full of people. Here and there, small troops of soldiers were starting their retreat, heavily packed, riding old rickety bicycles. Even though it had been so long ago and Johanna had been a very young girl, she still remembered when the German troops had entered the town. How arrogantly they had paraded through the streets of the town that they rode through now so silently and quickly, hoping nobody would notice them. In the afternoon, Captain Braun knocked on the door of the den as they were just starting their lunch. Next to him stood the same heavy sack that he had brought with him almost a year ago. He seemed ready to leave. "I came to say goodbye," he said to grandfather and grandmother, making one of his stiff little bows and smiling at Johanna. "We've had our orders to retreat as fast as we can from here, but I could not go without saying goodbye to you." Grandfather and grandmother got up from their chairs. Grandmother was the first to reach out her hand to him. "I hope," she said, "you will find everybody well when you get home." "Oh yes," Captain Braun's face lighted up. "Thank God, my parents and my wife and our little boy are safe." He kissed grandmother's hand. "I am not sorry to leave," he continued. "I hated the war and I'm glad it's all over. But I shall miss the little riders. I have often taken them out from their hiding place during my lonesome evenings, and I wished I could have seen them ride on their white horses." He stretched his hand hesitantly toward grandfather. "I wish you and them the best of everything." "Maybe," grandfather said slowly, "maybe many, many years from now, when this terrible war is not so fresh in our memory, when we have been able to forget a little, you will come back and see them ride in their full glory over our town." Captain Braun looked Grandfather straight in the eyes. "Is that an invitation?" he asked. Grandfather hesitated. I think so," he finally said, and he shook Captain Braun's hand. Captain Braun bent down and kissed Johanna's hand, just as he had done with Grandmother. "There is something," he said to Johanna, "that I didn't want to take with me. Our trip will probably be rough and hard, and I didn't want any harm to come to it. I left it for you upstairs." He clicked his heels and bowed again and reached for his sack. Grandfather offered to help carry it down, but Captain Braun laughed as he refused and swung the heavy sack over his shoulder. He walked quickly downstairs without looking back. Johanna heard the front door close behind him. Captain Braun was gone. Although they had just started lunch, nobody was hungry anymore. Johanna waited till Grandfather and Grandmother had gone downstairs. Then she started up to her attic room. Halfway up the creaking stairs, she sat down, trying to picture how everything would be now that the Germans had gone. "Tonight," she thought, "I'll sleep again in my room. Soon the riders will be back, and I will hear again the carillon play when I am just about to fall asleep. But I won't hear the flute. I never will hear it again." She walked slowly up the rest of the stairs. Carefully, she opened the door. The room was light as the sun streamed in through the open window, making a pattern of stripes on the floor and on the walls. The wood of the table shone with sunlight, as if it had just been polished. Johanna's eyes had to get used to the bright light after the dark stairway. Then she saw the velvet case with the embroidered mountain flowers lying on the table. In it was the flute. A note lay next to it. Johanna went over and sat down on the windowsill. The sunlight seemed sharp, and her eyes started to sting as she read the words slowly. "To a brave girl from her friend, William Braun." The next day, the Allied soldiers arrived in town. They were Canadians. The streets were so packed with cheering people that the men in blue coveralls had difficulty keeping order. At first, a single man on a motorbike came. He raced with terrific speed through the town and was gone before the people realized that they had seen the first Canadian. For a few hours, nothing happened. Then the jeeps came and trucks loaded with soldiers. They didn't look at all like soldiers, Johanna thought. They looked tremendously healthy and beautifully clean, crisp uniforms. They smiled and waved their caps. Nobody could ever be afraid of these soldiers, Johanna decided. They tried to talk to her, but she couldn't understand the strange words. The soldiers laughed and stuffed her pockets with wonderful things that Johanna hadn't seen in years. Chocolates and other candies, delightful smelling soap that she would give Grandmother, and cigarettes for Grandfather. The people were wild with joy and relief, and there was nothing but feasting these first wonderful days of freedom. Then the town began to prepare for the official celebration of its liberation. Grandfather and Johanna went to work to make the little riders ready so that they could return to the church steeple in time for the celebration. During the day, Grandfather was busy in town, but in the evenings after supper, he and Johanna went to the church tower together. Grandfather worked on the mechanism while Johanna cleaned and polished the riders and the horses, who had become a little dusty in their hiding place. They always worked till dark. One evening when Grandfather was working late, Johanna went over to the oval window in the church tower and looked out over the marketplace. Small groups of soldiers were strolling leisurely around. They stopped in the middle of the marketplace and pointed at the old church and some of the old houses. Then, from the other side of the marketplace came a tall soldier. He didn't walk leisurely as the other soldiers did, nor did he walk as if he were a soldier in a strange city. He walked deliberately, as if he had a purpose and as if he knew his way. It's just as if this happened once before, Johanna thought, as if I saw him once long ago coming toward me while I was standing at the window. The soldier walked so fast that Johanna, who could see only the opposite side of the marketplace, lost sight of him. Still she thought of him as she watched the scene below, more soldiers and some children playing ball. Now a soldier caught the ball and threw it back to the laughing children. Grandfather was ready to go now, and it was almost dark in the church tower. Johanna helped Grandfather pack his tools in the toolbox. They would have to work only a few more nights, and the little riders would be ready to ride again on their horses. Johanna was just saying goodnight to them when the hinges of the door of the church tower squeaked. "That's Grandmother, Johanna," Grandfather said, "to see what we are doing here together in the dark." "We are coming," Johanna shouted as she rushed toward the staircase. But at the bottom of the stairs, she didn't see Grandmother. Instead, she saw the tall soldier whom she had watched coming across the marketplace. He took off his cap as he looked up to Johanna and Grandfather standing at the top of the stairs. Grandfather stood still for 1 second, looking down at the soldier. Then, without saying a word, he started to run down the stairs. "I always knew he would come to take me back home with him," Johanna thought as she started to run after Grandfather. And because she wasn't carrying a heavy toolbox, she could run faster than Grandfather. Halfway down the stairs, she overtook him and pushed him aside. She ran down the last few stairs and straight into her father's outstretched arms. But how strange that I ever thought I had forgotten what he looked like, she thought. I would have recognized him anywhere. Here's a picture. And that is the end of chapter 5. Stay tuned for chapter 6, which is the final chapter of the book. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget to like and even share if you want to. Mwah!